years in terms of, scaling up the sector, and how does what's proposed impact on that? Is it positive or negative, or is there something that should be included that's not? I made note that the general scheme. Clearly, there's a thread that seems to be running through that there's a great deal of additional obligations. That's what it seems like, additional obligations. Are those additional obligations balanced in favour? I heard somebody say something about the regulator should really have an enabling role rather than, if you like, a role that is overseeing and making sure good governance, and where you're trying to find a balance between both. I'd be curious to hear what could be done and what would it look like if there was an enabling role. The regulatory impact analysis, I think that's generally a good idea, because it's actually quite difficult to kind of, in an academic sense, kind of visualise the change, and I think that would be quite useful. Just in terms of cooperative housing, in terms of the 3,500, what kind of is the breakdown in relation to the tenure, and have there been different experiences with stock that is tenanted as opposed to purchased? Just there was one other question. We've got quite a fragmented approach to a lot of how we do things, and in many ways it hasn't worked to our advantage. The role of the regulator being independent of the housing agency, why is that so important? You might just articulate that for us. And just finally, in relation to the regulator, is the regulator looking at, or I think somebody might have said it doesn't govern the landlord-tenant role. Should it govern that? I know that there's other legislation if there's an independent regulator, because clearly there's one thing managing the physical stock, but in actual fact there's quite a role in managing the stock from the point of view of tenant management, if you like, or where there's a mixed scheme, how that might work. Is that seen as something that could be incorporated here? Leave it at that. Thank you, Deputy. Anyone else have any questions? Robert Oates.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome all our visitors today. Deputy Murphy has asked most of the questions that I want to ask, but if I could just ask a couple. I get the impression from your contributions that, broadly speaking, you're in favour of this bill. Do you see it primarily as improving the organisation as to how approved housing bodies work, or do you see it as having any role in terms of improving delivery of housing, which is obviously vitally important? And I'd be very interested in your response to the issue that Deputy Murphy raised about the Housing Finance Agency and the ability or otherwise to get access to that funding. While this isn't directly to do with the bill, could I just ask, Mr. Allen mentioned that there were 536 housing bodies. How many of them are actually active and are likely to deliver housing? I'll leave it to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy. Now we'll go in the order in which people address the committee. I'll go to Mr. Allen first.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll deal with some of Deputy Murphy's questions first, maybe, if I may. So, in terms of how did the voluntary code work, certainly from my evidence of how it's worked, I think it has worked very well. And I think it has been a positive experience for the bodies that have engaged with the Interim Regulation Office. I think, if you like, the principles of enabling and learning that have been inherent, if you like, in the application of the voluntary code are something that we want to ensure are maintained through to the statute. So that's been something that we've been very keen to observe and very keen to maintain. And so, for example, in the publication of the financial standard by the Regulation Office, I think it was during the summer this year, you'll see when you look at that how it has been made proportionate, so that, for example, if it applies to one of the larger approved housing bodies, there'll be quite an onerous amount of information required from them. But if it is, insofar as it applies to the smaller so-called Tier 1 approved housing bodies, they don't have to provide the same level of, for example, long-term business planning, long-term strategic plans. They need to provide instead maybe detailed income and expenditure accounts. So it's been tailored, if you like, the application of the code. So I think it's worked very well, and as I say, that's something that we would like to ensure is kind of maintained through as the statute develops. Will it assist in upscaling? I think it will, and I think it will because the presence of regulation has been shown in other jurisdictions to be an important consideration for lenders, so that there is some, if you like, structure there that underpins the overall sector. So from that point of view, it should help. But I would say also that it is but one of a number of considerations that are required in order for upscaling to take place. And I suppose the department works very closely with the sector in the context of the social housing strategy, for example, and the working groups in that, to look at what those various levers might be. Regulation obviously is one, but the kind of funding schemes that are available, the sort of mechanics behind those schemes in terms of how funding is released and how early into a project and how quickly it's released, these are all important considerations as well. So I suppose my point, Deputy, is that yeah, I think it will, but it's just one of a number of levers that need to be in place for upscaling to take place. The obligations, are they balanced? I think they are. Again, I mean, I would acknowledge that in crafting this legislation, it is quite a balancing act, if you like, in terms of providing, sufficient powers for the regulator to be that the regulator can actually function when they need to. But at the same time, not wanting to interfere with the boardroom decisions that approved housing bodies will make as regards their own investment decisions and so on. So that is a balancing act, and it is something that we are very conscious of and are trying to ensure is present in the general scheme. The landlord-tenant role and that, okay, in terms of whether that could be integrated, well, only I think two weeks ago we enacted the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act, which extended the Residential Tenancies Act to AHB tenants and AHB landlords. So I suppose that has worked to some extent to remove one of the areas of fragmentation that there was. So at least now for tenants who are, whether they're in the private rented sector or the AHB sector, there is a common, if you like, area for them to go to. But in terms of having a one-stop shop for all tenancies and all all providers of housing, I think we're still a bit removed from that. What we're proposing in the context of this bill is a very, I suppose, specialised outfit, and I think there's merit, certainly in the short term anyway, in focusing on that and getting that regulation right and getting it correct before we would look at a catch-all sort of structure that would encompass all tenancies and all providers. In terms of the number of bodies, Deputy Dowds, that are active, and you're right, it's a large number of approved bodies that are there in terms of 526. I suppose there's a huge disparity, as you probably know, insofar as some of those bodies, a lot of them would be very, very small local community projects who are providing, you know, 1 or 2 houses or 3 or 4 houses in their community. And at the other end of the scale, you have quite large bodies that are providing hundreds and even thousands of homes for people. So it's quite a disparate sector. If you were to look at the number of bodies that have registered or signed up to voluntary regulation, there's 210 of those. You could say that that's an indication maybe of the most active ones and the ones that are most active and that are developing. But I think from looking at the Regulation Office's report, I think the Regulation Office plans to undertake a review of all the approved bodies, and the department will work with them on that in terms of trying to get a better handle really on that balance, that 300 or so. Where are they? What are they doing? Are they still in the business of providing housing? And are they still in the business perhaps of wanting to develop that? Or are they happy with the service that they currently provide, which may be just to maintain, if you like, the service that they have for the small number of properties that they have?
Thank you. Mr. McManus.
Thanks, Chair. Just following on from Deputy Murphy and Deputy Dow's mentioned in relation to the scaling up aspect of the sector and how this regulation can deliver. It was mentioned earlier on the voluntary code. There are probably 4 dimensions to assisting the sector in scaling up. One is certainly regulation, and the other were new financial models which have emerged, building capacity and predictable funding streams. So bringing all those together certainly will provide the platform for upscaling. In terms of what the sector can offer, a couple of years ago we did a survey for the larger bodies, and their ambition was to deliver 5,000 homes over 3 years, and that's what private finance. Just bear in mind the context. Many other countries are brought in private finance 30 years ago. It took almost 30 years for that to be a major issue for delivering social housing. We're doing it in 5 years. So we're trying to bring regulation in, have funding for private finance at the same time. So a few things have to come together. So those 4 elements of policy coordination, financial models, and building capacity. And building capacity additions in relation to land supply. Land supply is another issue the sector needs in terms of delivery. But certainly there is ambition in the sector, especially for the larger bodies who want to supply more housing. They have targets in their own mind what they want to deliver. And certainly we think the sector has much more to provide over the next 5 and 10 years. Like private finance just doesn't manifest itself into housing over a couple of years. If we're looking at 10 years as a life cycle, we certainly think the sector will move to be very much dependent on the public sector, 100% finance into private finance. But we need the other elements in place as well. For the smaller bodies, for the Tier 1 bodies, we have been working with some of the Tier 1 bodies to build up their own capacity in the regulation process as well. Bearing in mind that they have 3 or 4 bits of regulation introduced in the last couple of years. The Charities Regulation, there's been HICWA, there's been the HSE, and this has come on the back of a number of issues. In terms of the landlord-tenant relationship, it is probably better to separate the regulation of the organisation than the landlord and tenants, so tenants have their own rights to seek the remedies as well as landlords. But certainly, moving forward, we do see regulation as a key element of the 4 elements to assist the sector and build the confidence of investors. And we are finding that over the last year, the single biggest thing investors ask for is the sector regulated. And investors like the European Investment Bank with the Housing Finance Agency, a number of private banks, and a number of bodies in the capital markets see regulation as a very useful tool to build up confidence for them, and we think that will certainly continue. So I think those 4 elements that we're working together will help to upscale the sector over the coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan.
Thank you, Chair. I think to a large extent I would agree with all that Donald McManus has said, but I'd add a few additional points. Firstly, Deputy Murphy asked about the voluntary code. I think it has been largely successful. It has governed the activities of most of the social housing stock, but it's very limited in its application. It doesn't bestow much in the way of powers on the regulator as such. So, this new bill we're looking at provides an entirely deeper and more appropriate framework. So we would very much welcome that. In terms of upscaling, again, I'd echo what the last two speakers have said, in that there are a number of things necessary for the social housing sector to make a leap forward. Regulation is one, and again, regulation is a requirement for any large-scale investor in order for them to have confidence in what's going on in the sector. The fact that it will be on a statutory basis should increase that confidence and should bring us to a place where we can look at other forms of finance which are set forward in the social housing strategy. And indeed, we welcome the strategy overall because it speaks in at least 3 or 4 parts about enhancing the capacity of social housing bodies such as the ones you see before you. So it sets out an aspiration that the sector itself will be upscaled in terms of its capacity. And again, there are a number of things around that. Funding we've already mentioned, regulation, but also access to sites, which has been mentioned, as non-state agencies. That must be put on some kind of proper footing, because without knowledge of the availability of sites upon which to build, it's very hard to put a programme of work in place within a very short time frame, which we're looking at present. The other issue, I would say, is around coordination from the state side. We welcome the fact, as has already been mentioned, that the department has moved on, is reviewing its own funding provisions for social housing, and they are improving. But there's also an issue of coordination among state agencies. The average AHB must deal with quite a few local authorities, as you would imagine, under a number of headings: planning, they are the housing authority, the allocator, the nominator, the housing finance agency, the department itself, the housing agency, and others, and deal with them, repeatedly. So we would suggest that a degree of coordination on the state side, with maybe one agency taking a lead role in that, could take huge time out of the period necessary to produce housing, and we want to produce as much as we can, as quickly as we can. The question was also asked by Deputy Murphy around the different tenures within cooperative housing. There are really 2 main aspects to it, although we believe cooperative housing is for everybody, regardless of their socio-economic status. We, as a rule, Cooperative Housing Ireland manages social rented units, but in the past, and indeed up to this day, we have assisted many people into cooperative ownership. Typically what would happen is a group of people would come together. They would acquire a site, maybe from the local council through the low-cost site scheme, and through their cooperative efforts, they would collectively produce housing at a lower cost and at less risk to themselves. And then that housing would go off, once complete, into private ownership. As I said, our organisation has assisted over 3,500 people do that. We still do it, and we want to continue doing it. But again, that's something we think needs to be enhanced, enabled, and further assistance brought to it. In terms of Deputy Dowds asked about the enabling aspect of the proposed regulatory arrangements before us. I think it is good that we're in at the early stage on this, because I think on the one hand you can fully understand why a new regulator would want to set out its stall, would want to gain, as they would see it, the appropriate powers. We want to see appropriate and strong regulation and independent regulation. But there must be a bit of balance, we would say, where the regulator has an enabling role. It's not just about protecting the asset, promoting security around tenure. It's about the things we've just been speaking about. In other words, the regulator also has a role in enabling the entire social housing sector, we would say. Not just by providing confidence, but promoting standards, helping us all move to a place where we can aspire to much more than we do today.
Thank you. Yeah,
I
Mr.
just
Sullivan.
only add one point on Deputy Murphy had asked the question why it was important to separate the regulator from the housing agency, and I suppose, you know, we would say, I mean, first of all, Ciarán mentioned that there's a need really for a single, stronger point of contact for us to work with, and we would see the housing agency play that role. But if you're holding yourself out as the regulator and the arbiter of good governance, then it's vitally important that your own governance is whiter than white. And so having a regulator that sits within a government body that's tasked with promoting delivery, tasked with securing very challenging targets and objectives, then it naturally follows that there should be a split between the organisation that's trying to push delivery and the organisation that's trying to protect the interests of tenants and public investment. And that's why we would argue for that split between those two roles.
Chair, just come back in on 2 points. I mean, one of the points that Mr. Brennan mentioned, which I think is obviously very important, I mean, to what extent can you, in a sense, get access to land by contacting county councils, or do you have to just deal with private developers? Because in some cases, the councils will have land. I mean, and does that depend on you, or are there any sort of leads out to you from councils that asking you to sort of show an active interest? And the issue that both Deputy Murphy and myself raised about the Housing Finance Agency and access to their funding, I'd be interested, although it may not be directly connected with this, but it's something that came up here at a very recent meeting, and they seem to have quite a bit of money that seems to be sitting there at the moment, and it'd be far better if it was used for housing construction in some shape or form. Thanks.
Chairman, I'll begin with the first question. Deputy has asked about the availability or seeking sites for AHBs. I think all AHBs are in the same position, that there is no entitlement, if I can put it that way, to sites. One must, as you say, go foraging among local authorities and indeed the private sector and elsewhere. But, you know, we are, let's face it, in a crisis situation around social housing. There is a degree of coordination being brought to bear through the governance structure around the social housing strategy. We would hope that there will be shortly protocols agreed with some local authorities around the allocation of resources, be they sites or indeed completed Part 5 units and so on. We want to avoid a situation, I would suggest, among the voluntary bodies that we end up unnecessarily competing for sites or for properties, pushing up prices, for example, against each other. It would be totally unwise and a bad use of our resources and state resources. So we think it's vitally important that protocols are agreed around that.
Yeah. Actually, it's very useful to hear some of the practical points, including the coordination on the state side, so that you know you can get on with what you're doing, as opposed to spending a lot of time with interacting with various state agencies, and indeed around the availability of sites, which it seems to me there should be some sort of a national kind of register at least of what's available and what can be brought into beneficial use as quickly as possible. But one of the things that several of the contributors have said is that the importance of regulation in terms of drawing on international or drawing on institutional funds. It's going to take some time for this piece of legislation to be enacted. We're only at a very early stages now. Is it still possible? I know it may not be the ideal situation for investors, but is it still under the voluntary code? Is it still possible to draw down some of the funds that might be available, because we're all acutely aware of the level of indebtedness of the country and the general government deficit and the debt profile, that there's a limited capacity for us to draw down funding on on balance sheet. So obviously you're looking for the opportunities off balance sheet. I mean, it could be another year, 18 months before this legislation is enacted. It looks like it has to be, there's quite a couple of processes to go through before we get to that stage. So under the voluntary code, has that been an impediment, given that you're telling us that it is an impediment?
Okay, that comes on automatically, Mr. McManus, the microphone. Look, it'll come on automatically. When you speak, it'll come on.
Yeah, and a couple of the issues there. In relation to the Housing Finance Agency, at the moment, in a sense, there's quite a lot of finance out there in the market coming to the sector because investors know they can get a reasonable return from the P&A agreement. That's the reality. Like, government yields are at that level, and the return is much higher in the sector. So there hasn't so much been an issue of the scale of finance coming into the sector as such. It's just a process of translating that loan finance into schemes on the ground. We have, at that side, we have finance, and the rubber product at the moment we don't have. For a number of the last 4 or 5 years, the sector utilised acquisitions in the private market, bought the acquisitions, and used the Housing Finance Agency and need other finance bodies to acquire those. That product isn't there as it was. That's why, as we've mentioned, the whole emphasis now is on new build to get sites assembled. And I think we'd have called for a land assembly programme. Okay, there are sites identified by the Housing Agency and others, but translate that into a land assembly programme. We had a very good low-cost site scheme for many years by the local authorities. That worked very successful, and housing associations accessed that and translated that into new build. In terms of community councils, that was a key tool 20 years ago. Community councils and voluntary groups would have donated sites to housing associations to deliver units. That's not there anymore. Most of those sites have been are not there, been taken up. So we have been relying on the private sector to bring forward both sites and new build developments as well. But we still need a number of options for sites, and that's why a low-cost site scheme that was successful before a number of years ago should be reactivated. There's land and land aggregation scheme that can be utilised for the sector, and it's important now we focus on the issue of land because it takes 2 or 3 years for it to go through the system, and that's why if we have a land assembly programme now, that will help to translate units over the next number of years. So the issue on the purpose of regulation, it's not totally an inhibitor for finance bodies saying there's no voluntary code at the moment, because we had 3 years ago we hadn't a Housing Finance Agency, we hadn't the 3 banks coming in, so they're coming in because they can see a return, and as long as you can repay the loans and there's a return, and there is a structure, the payment availability agreement is quite a useful structure, even on European terms. It's a cash flow for housing association to repay investors over 30 years, so it's reasonably solid. So I don't think in itself it is an impediment. I think what will help is, as it becomes more statutory, that may help the price of money coming in, may help to lower the price coming in at that time. At the moment, I think there are around 12 HBs approved by the Housing Finance Agency. There's probably another half dozen housing association access and private finance. One thing we haven't done yet is access to capital markets, and we've had some discussions internally in the sector for a special finance vehicle controlled by HBs to see could we do that. It is off balance sheet, Deputy Murphy, the idea. So we are trying to progress, but it hasn't been a full inhibitor at the moment. There's no statutory regulation, because I think some of the financial institutions realise this is going to happen. This is going to happen, whether it's in 6 months or a year's time. I think the benefit of having statutory regulation, it could bring in even more investors, because they know there's intervention, they know there's engagement with something ever went awry.
So any of our witnesses who haven't spoken, do any want to say a few words? Yeah, Karen.
Thank you very much. Just on the question of scale, because I think it's come up a few times repeatedly, we've done our own internal survey looking at the pipeline among some of our larger members, and we would estimate that there are about 3,200 units in the pipeline for delivery by 2017. Now, as with all development pipelines, like they will fall in and out, schemes will fall in and out of that, but we would estimate that the capacity of the sector is growing, albeit incrementally over the last number of years. And even if you look at the level of applications to the HFA, that has increased over the last year. So I think there's 180 million in applications currently with the HFA, even though 60 million has only been drawn down. That's part of a sort of stage payments and building process, so that will be drawn down over time. And there's up to 500 million available there. So hopefully that particular pipeline that I'm talking about, the 3,000 units, can be built out. But the question of some of the structural barriers that are there, like the coordination of the schemes and access to sites, does have to be, I suppose, tackled now, so that for kind of future years, 2017 on, that we have the pipeline built up in advancement, because I think it's been well stated that it takes 18 months to 2 years for a scheme to sort of see fruition. So just looking at those particular structural barriers, and in particular the access to sites in a very coordinated and programmed way, because local authorities do have sites in their ownership and public bodies. So if there was a programme there, I think that would make a significant difference over the lifetime of the strategy, because we, in terms of available product on the market at the moment, there's very little there in terms of acquisitions. So we are looking at needing to construct and to be planning for that now over the next to see delivery over the coming years.
Largely in the Greater Dublin area, or?
The 3,200 units, is it? Yeah. No, that's a nationwide survey, but it is among a small number of our AHBs, so it's among our larger bodies. If there is a CAS call, this year we had a CAS call at the beginning of the year, and approvals were granted at the end of July. So you would find for a CAS call that they'd be spread fairly well throughout the country. But again, it's very difficult to plan ahead for CAS when it's based on a call. So you may have a scheme in mind for a CAS programme, but you can't actually put in an application until there's a call in place. So again, that's part of the coordination issues that we're talking about. We don't know from year to year when the next CAS call is going to be. So again, it's to be able to kind of bring together those sorts of systems in place so that we can predict and plan really to deliver better.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, deputies. Just to add to what my colleagues have said, just reiterate the point. I think when the statutory regulation comes in, it will give security to banks, financial institutions who want to loan to the sector. That's very, very evident. They want a framework that gives safety for them, and I think in that sense, the regulator's bill and the office will enable better delivery, right? Some of your questions are on the performance aspect and the delivery by the sector, which is understandable in the current context. But I would just go back to the legislation, really, and the proposed heads of terms, because I think it's fairly substantive, the powers that are being proposed for the regulator. I think, and we'd all be of this view, that the enabling aspect of enabling the sector to develop, of giving safety for it, is really, really important in terms of the governance of the sector, and I see that boards and the sector delivers, that there's common things on performance standards. The sector has worked with the Voluntary Regulator's Office to have a financial code that's agreed. And we're now going to engage as well on performance standards with the Voluntary Regulator's Office to see that there's common measurement of how we deliver the services that we do. So I think that's a reassuring thing for everybody, that it's very apparent and transparent what we're delivering and how we're delivering it. I think the legislation itself is quite complicated. It's alluded to even in the heads of terms of the bill. There are constitutional aspects on this that is alluded to in terms of the suggested powers that has been given to the Regulator's Office of intervening over the disposal of assets. Now, that's not an insignificant statement, and it's noted, and I'm sure the principal officers and the Attorney General will have to deal with it. It's really, really important. Equally, it is going to overlap with other legislation that relates to the Companies Act 2014 and no doubt finance legislation and everything else. So it's not a simple piece of legislation. It will need careful preparation by the department and consideration by yourselves, and equally input by the Irish Council for Social Housing and the cooperative movement as well, in terms of trying to temper this in a way that is effective, efficient and transparent for the delivery of housing as well, and the regulation. So it's quite a large, complex bill actually, and I think it's going to take some time. I think it is important that it is enacted. The sector does welcome it. In broad terms, we welcome it. We've engaged with the Voluntary Regulation Code. Most people are signed up to it, and we see it as being very necessary for public confidence in it, by citizens, but equally by legislators like yourself. So I can only wish you well with the endeavours over the next number of months.
I think time is against us.
General election to get it away as well,
Okay, listen, I want to thank all of our witnesses for their interaction with the committee members this evening. You are now excused. You are free to go. I hate saying that, but you are free to go. Okay, we're going to suspend the meeting for 2 minutes and resume in private session.